Good evening. Hello. Shalom. So what we're doing tonight is looking into the names of disciples and apostles, and if we get time, various other people in the New Testament in regards to their nicknames, surnames, code names, and aliases. Her name was McGill, and she called herself Lil, but everyone knew her as Nancy. Paul McCartney. The names in the New Testament are a lot like those lyrics. Her name was McGill. She called herself Lil, but everyone knew her as Nancy. There's probably a good reason for that, because these disciples and followers of Yahshua were criminals. They were criminals. They were sought by Romans, by the Jewish administration, by groups of lesti, that is, groups of conspirators, and probably everybody else. Even the king was after these guys because they considered them seditioners, whether they were or not. So like criminals in our own history, Blackbeard, I looked some up today and maybe I can remember one or two more. Blackbeard, you know what I mean, Bluebeard. I can't remember right now, but you know what I'm talking about here. Or the boss, like Capone. Their names, the names they used were often surnames or nicknames, aliases, or code names, so they couldn't be easily identified through a name. Of course, at this time, you got a name, you can be identified. But if nobody knows your name, you're going to be hard to find. I'm going to go to start in Mark chapter 3, verse 13. And as I go through these names, I'll start out for each one with their Hebrew name or Aramaic name, and then I'll identify who they are in our New Testament. And I'll just say while we're at it here, the New Testament authors, redactors, and translators had a very hard time with Hebrew. If you look up some of these translators from way on back, like John Tyndall, and the ones early on that were still using Old or Middle English, you'll find that they knew nothing about Hebrew. How they got some of these names, like Joseph of Arimathea, which I mentioned before, is a big question mark. But we've been stuck with them, so we will transliterate them anyway for you here. So Mark 3:13 says, Yahshua, Jesus, goes up in the mountain and calls those whom he wanted to him. This is literal translation. And to him they went. And he appointed Epoiasin, which you can hear right there. Appointed is a real good translation because it sounds a lot like the Greek Epoiasin. He appointed 12 so that they might be with him, even that he might send them to preach and have authority to cast out the demons. This is verse 16. And as he appointed the 12, and he added a name to Simeon, Simon. As he appointed the 12, literally it says, and he added a name to Simeon, that's Simon, of course, that name being Kepha, which you read as Peter or Kephas, Cephas, some people say. 17, As for Yaakov, James, how Yaakov came to be James is a long story we'll catch up with later. Yaakov of Zavdi, Yaakov of Zavdi, or Zabed, or Zebed, or Zebediah, or most unlikely is Zebedee. There's nobody named that in the Old Testament. So it's probably Yaakov of Zabdi, and it does not say that he's the son of somebody named Zebedee. It just says of him, which we'll find out in other places. That could be a brother, a twin brother. That could be the name of a criminal gang, for that matter. And Yochanan, John, the brother of Yaakov, James. So one thing we do know pretty well straight is that Yaakov and Yochanan were brothers. And he also added a name to them, Benim Regesh. And here's a really good example of how the early translator just really had no idea of what he was reading there. He writes Boanerges, Benim Regesh. In fact, this is what we named our former bishop, Bishop Benim Regesh. That is, as the scripture says, sons of thunder. Regesh means commotion. So I guess we could include thunder in that. And Andreas, Andrew, and Philippos, Philip, and Bartalmai, Bartholomew, not too good there, and Matitya, or Matityahu, or Matit, or Matthias, as Matthew, and Toma is Thomas, and Yaakov of the Halfi, Yaakov, James of the Halfi, Alphaeus. Your Bible probably says James, son of Alphaeus. And again, there's no son of in there. There's just a genitive construction, which implies possession. So we would say that if we did it right, it'd be Yaakov of the Halfi. And Tadai, Thaddeus, and Shimon the Canaanite, also called the Zealot somewhere else, and Yehuda Sicarii. Our Bibles have Judas Iscariot. Sicarii means the assassin. A little more, it means the dagger man. A sikara is a dagger, and the blade is usually bent. Sometimes we see them as blades used in the Middle East, even yet today, or blades used in ceremonial kinds of things. A little dagger with a blade that's curved. And so we've got Yehuda, the assassin, who even betrays him. And there are other lists like this. Genesis 17, for instance, 1 Peter chapter 2. But we'll skip those for now. There's a lot to do tonight. In the Bible, the study of names, that means a lot. The Almighty Yahweh said that his name was to be remembered in all generations. Exodus 3:15. And those who take his name in vain will be held accountable. Exodus 27. And that's why I use the Almighty's name in all my teaching. And I explained it the other night. I think I've done 4 shows this week. Is that Though Yahweh says to use his name in common conversation in several places in his word, I would say we need to haul that in, use it in front of those that know it, maybe not in front of those that don't. Because as I've told this story, I introduced that name in a church service the first day I was in a particular church as pastor. And after the service, I heard a couple of people joking about that name. They went, yabba dabba doo. Whoa, that's a Flintstones god, something like that. And I was just appalled. And that's what began to think that I don't need to spread this name in such a wide reach as I had. In many cases, though, we only get a small glimpse of these Bible people. Very little is said about any of them in the New Testament, but we do find a wealth of information in their names, especially their nicknames. As we read in our Old Testament lesson, Yahweh changed the names of both Avram and Sarai. Avram means high father. Sarai means my lady. Changed them to Avraham and Sarah. Avraham means father of a multitude, or so I read. And Sarah means high lady or princess. Names that are in accordance with Yahweh's great promises that he had promised both of them. But in the text of the new good news, Yahshua here in Mark is picking out his 12 who would continue the apostolic ministry and tradition that he started, just as the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us that the Yahad did, picking out their 12. You can't appoint 3 priests to make it 15 unless you start out with 12 and see who's going to make the priest. Some of these men we know about from their own letters or acts recorded somewhere in the Bible or in apocryphal literature. We can learn a lot about them because in several cases, these disciples' names were added to their common names as descriptions of their mission or character, or even their physical appearance. In fact, some of these men in the scripture aren't known by their real names at all. That would be probably level 2 names games, but by nicknames only. What we can learn about these by their aliases is wide-ranging. In the translation I just read to you, I made that with very great care regarding the rendering of the names in both the original tongue and in English. And I'm going to put a little parenthesis in there. In translating these New Testament names, 5 languages may be involved, and maybe more, including Aramaic, especially Western Aramaic, or we sometimes called Syriac in stuff we read, pretty much the same, a little different. That was the common language of these disciples insofar as we know. Also, we have to deal with Hebrew because the prophets write primarily in Hebrew, which was the language of the faith, the church language at that time. This is still in the Ethiopian church, Ethiopian Orthodox. They don't speak Ge'ez except in church. And up until Vatican II, you didn't go to a Catholic church that was spoken, the service was spoken in English, rather Latin. That was their sacred language. So, though the people couldn't understand it because Latin is a dead language, they didn't think until Vatican II to allow people to understand what was being said. The third language is Greek. That was the language of the world at that time. Undoubtedly, the disciples knew some Greek because there were as many Greeks in Galilee as there were Aramaic speakers, maybe more. I already mentioned Latin, the language of the Romans at that time. The fifth language is English, which is our tongue, which has very little relationship with Hebrew, a little bit, but not a whole lot. For without an excellent translation, how would we, in our generation, understand anything unless we would try to learn Hebrew? And that's not all that certain, because that was all but a dead language until 1948, when it was resuscitated. So we're going to start out with a common name for the master, which is Jesus Christ. Let's start with his name. His name is a Hebrew combination of words meaning Yah is salvation and pronounced Yahshua. I'll tell you why Yahshua and not Yeshua in a minute. Yah is the sacred name of the Almighty in its poetic form, and you find it that way in several of the Psalms. In Yahshua's day, pronouncing that name could mean a death sentence if any of the other sects besides Essenes or Nazarenes heard you do that. So Jesus' name, Yahshua, was commonly pronounced Yeshua, so as to avoid saying Yah at that time. Now it's still pronounced Yeshua because you take those letters separately and they say something like, may his name be cursed. Can't remember exactly. But still today, people, even sacred name people, use the name Yeshua. Jewish people, if they're going to talk about him, if they don't call him the apostate, then they're going to call him Yeshua because of the anagram that's made of that name. But we can consider when E is used between the first letter and the third letter as having a schwa sound. I have explained why it is Yahshua and not Yeshua in several lessons before. It's in the transmission of the Hebrew name through all these languages, and really it ends up in the United States why there's an E in there. But schwa sound, if a vowel is printed upside down in somebody's name or in a text, that means it takes the pronunciation or or ah. So we can see if they pronounce the name Yeshua, then they're even pronouncing it wrong because it's Yahshua, just as the sacred name is Yahweh. I have no doubt about it, but you have to prove it for yourself. If you need help with that, I can help you. Christ, that isn't a name, it's a title. It comes from the Hindi root meaning, that is Indian, meaning anointed. The Hindu god named Krishna also derives from this root exclusively. Krishna came along about 500 years before Messiah did. So we can tell by that that certainly this word Christ came into Greek from the East, from the language of the Indians. I don't mean Indians here, I mean Indians there. But we might, in its fullest form, translate Jesus Christ to Yah is salvation and Yahshua is his anointed one. Christos is correctly pronounced just as I did, Christos, in its original language. And in the language of the Romans, it was Christos. And it probably should not be used. I don't use Christ. In fact, if I read Christ, I'm going to not read Christ anymore. I'm going to read over Christ and think Messiah. Because Christos is a pagan title. It was also used for the emperor. It was also used for slave masters. And it still means the anointed one, but there's another meaning for it as well. Christ also means smeared. And if you didn't know this, they were first called Christians in Antioch, not because that was a compliment. It was supposed to mean in their mind something like smeared with excrement, a smear. They were called smears, not s'mores. Smears. You don't make s'mores with excrement. But that's what they called them in Antioch because they didn't like them. It was a sect. And Antioch, of course, was the headquarters of Pauline and Barnabas Christianity. So I don't use it. Yahshua the Messiah, which also means anointed, Moshiach, anointed, it also means smeared. But it's not from a pagan background. And you can see that Christ, in pronouncing it, has nothing to do with Messiah. Say Messiah or Moshiach instead of Christ if you want to be correct in that area, and some of us just have a need. I would say undoubtedly that Yahshua's name among his friends and relatives was not Jesus Christ. It was probably simply Yosh, who had two friends. One's name was Yak. The other's name was Yoke. Yash, Yak, and Yoke. That's Yahshua, Yochanan, and Yaakov. That's probably what they called themselves if they ever played baseball out in the park. For many centuries, there were two kinds of Christianities. Actually, three. There was Nazarene. We call it Jewish Christianity today. I wouldn't even call it Christian. The second kind was Orthodox Christianity or Roman Christianity. And the third was Gnostic Christianity. And the Gnostics, probably, there were more Gnostics than there were Orthodox, because Gnosticism, like Manichaeism and Mandaeanism, two types of Gnostic Christianity, they were far more wide-ranging and with far greater numbers of devotees than Orthodox Christianity or Nazarene Christianity, insofar as we know. Now, these Gnostic Christians, they called the creator Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth. Don't say it. I'm saying it because I'm teaching it. That was the name of the creator, who was entirely evil, as well as everything that he created on earth was entirely evil. So the earth was entirely evil. And so what we should be doing as Gnostic believers would be to get out of this world by some means. And the way you could get out was to pursue knowledge. Gnosticism, it means the pursuit of knowledge. Exactly. So what they had to do was they had to know how to get saved, and especially exactly how to get saved, or they simply couldn't be saved to a higher heaven than Yaldabaoth ruled. So that Fortunately, that name is gone, except there are still Gnostic Christians in this world. We would call them today primarily New Age. New Age. Let's go on to the number one disciple. Have I gone an hour yet? Time flies. That is Shimon Kifa, Simon Peter. Peter's name, as I said before, was Shimon or Shimeon. He calls himself Shimeon in one of his letters, which he may or may not have written. Shimon is, of course, the first word of the Shema. This was the most popular name in Israel in Yeshua's lifetime. Yes, if you're in a crowd in Jerusalem or in Galilee, in Sepphoris, and you called out Shimon, probably half the people there will turn around and look. It's pretty much well known today, especially since, 10 years ago or so, one of Israel's foreign ministers was in the news a lot, and that's Shimon Peretz. Shimon means, as you know, hearer, one who hears with the intention of doing. Yeshua added the name to him, Kifa, making him Shimon or Shimeon Kifa. Kifa is Aramaic, and it means a stone. Kifa comes to us through Greek and Latin as Peter, P-E-T-E-R. Oh, you already knew that. From the Greek word, they say Petros, but probably Petra, a feminine word that means a stone. In the New Testament, Matthew chapter 18, is it? Where he says, and you are Peter. The word used there is not Petros, but Petra. Why would Yeshua or his surrogate, the writer, use a feminine word for the Messiah? Or not for the Shimon Kifa? Sorry, his name was Stone. I don't know. But we have inherited Peter, and I've heard that name a lot because I have a brother with that name. So Shimon Kifa or Simon Peter might be translated something like a stone hearing and obeying. We also might note that Petra, the feminine, is also the name of that city built out of rock in the Middle East. I think it's in Jordan. The entire city is built by digging out rock from a mountain. Looks like marble or some kind of hard clay. Go take a look at that sometime on the internet. City of Petra. It is amazing. P-E-T-R-A. I wish I could go there just to see it. This is an important sanctuary city for those persecuted by Paul and his ilk, according to Clement of Rome in his Epitomes 170. Today, there's a popular actor known as The Rock. We watched him on a movie about a week ago. I don't know what his name is or where he comes from. He's just known as The Rock. And Kifa probably was too. Probably at that baseball game, he was called Keefe, shortened version. Or he was called Rocky. Why not? In many ways, Kifa was actually a lot like Rocky Balboa, that well-known movie character. Or one that's not known so well is Rocky Colavito, except Rocky Colavito's first name is actually Rocky. Remember him? Detroit Tigers, Cleveland Indians, right fielder, left fielder, great hitter, Rocky Colavito. Let's go on to the brother now. James and John. Said a little about them before, but James' given name, again, is Yaakov, and the meaning of that name is Yah is protection. It's got a second meaning, usurper, because of the Yaakov in the Old Testament stealing the birthright of his brother. But the good one is Yah is protection. I'm pretty sure that name was the one that was supposed to be used because of his character. How Yaakov got to be translated to English as James, well, as I said, it's a long story, but I'll tell you just a little of it. That name James came to us as James through Latin. The name Iacomus, Iacomus, though I'm positive that King James I of England might have had something to do with the use of this substitute name, James, in the King James Version. Yaakov's brother is Yochanan, John, and that means Yah is merciful. The Bible doesn't say that James and John are sons of Zebedee, as I said before, but only of Zebedee. I think I talked enough about that before. Could be Zavdai, Zabad, Zabid, Zabud. Zebul. Zebul means fly, remember? But this word means endowment, as close as we can get to it. Zebedee might not even have been a name at all, but a nickname. In my fictions about Yeshua's lost years, I have him as a character. Unfortunately, in my fictions, Zebediah gets murdered, but not in real life. Maybe he wasn't even a person. In the Old Testament, though, there were two people by this name, this name. The first was David's fighting man, ranked right alongside of Uriah the Hittite. That's in 1 Chronicles 11:41. Here's the name, Zabad, Z-A-B-A-D. The other was a temple priest and a close friend of King Solomon. We read about him in 1 Kings 4:5, and his name is Zabud. So James and John were sons of Zebedee, Zabad, Zabud, in the sense that they were made from the same mold as the Zavdeim of Israel's golden age of monarchy. For Yaakov, meaning Yah is protection, embodies the Zavdi, who was a great warrior, like Uriah. And John, Yochanan, Yah is merciful, embodies the Zavdai, who was the compassionate priest and friend of royalty. Furthermore, Yeshua gives a collective title to these men, calling them Benim Regesh, not Boanerges. Benim Regesh means sons of thunder, but primarily sons of contention or sons of competition. The word sons there just simply mean they were contentious, they were competitive, they were thundering. These fellows might have been outspoken in their various ways. I'm thinking that one was rather subdued and cerebral, and the other was the man with a sword. So the one with the sword would be very aggressive. The one with the cerebrum would have been more docile, but maybe more wise, maybe more willing to think about something before he did it. But both in their own way, very powerful, very aggressive people. So you can look to sometimes Job 37:5 and other places where Elohim thunders wondrously with his voice. He does great things that we cannot comprehend. This Yaakov may have spoken too loudly, for he was beheaded by King Herod, according to Acts 12:2, perhaps the first of the martyrs as well. I had a roach there hanging down on my glasses. Yochanan, on the other hand, may have been the longest lived of all disciples, but it's hard to imagine Yochanan, a contentious troublemaker, as the author of the spiritual history of the movement, that is, the Gospel according to John, the title of which was added much later to the text, or to the letters attributed to John. The Revelation bears little literary resemblance to the other Johns in the New Testament and may well have been recorded by a son of thunder. The Revelation, the son of thunder or contention, since thunders speak throughout the apocalypse, and especially in Revelation 10:1-4, where the content of the voices of the seven thunders must be kept a secret. I found the seven thunders, what they said. Yes, I did. I'll just give you a hint if you ever want to go looking. Look into the passages of the book we just spoke from, that is Job. And if you're a lucky guy like me, you'll find them there. Some scholars say, of course, John didn't write the Revelation at all. But maybe John the Elder did. Here's what I think. I think the Apostle John wrote Revelation, and that John the Elder wrote the three little books, the three little letters to the assemblies. That's what I think about it. But James being gone, if we go to the Acts of Philip, which I have redacted in one of my books called Tales of the Messiah and His Gallant Friends, you'll read that John took up James' slogan and began to call for fire to come down from heaven and destroy the temple of snakes in, what's the name of the city where Philip is still buried? It's in Anatolia. I don't recall it right now, but there's several stories and acts that John is a character in, and some of them are quite good. Quite good. And with no reason, we couldn't believe them. But since the Roman Catholic Church of the 4th century decided they were not believable or were not in line with their doctrine, then, of course, that had the imprimatur of the Pope. And so they can't be right, right? So here's 3 Johns, and from the earliest time, all 3 were known in Nazarene history. Not much, just a bit. I think that these names and what they mean give us a lot more information about these people to be venerated than the rest of the New Testament. Even the Gospel or Revelation of John, they don't say anything about him. They're known in Nazarene history if you get down into the history and the tradition. My own contention is that John called the apostle, dictated the revelation, but not the other books. And I have talked about that a lot in my Revelation commentary called Revelation Uncloaked, copyright 1990. Additionally, some important modern scholarly work finds this Yaakov to be a semi-fictional substitute for Yaakov, James the Just, the brother of Yahshua. Get it? There's at least two Yaakovs in the disciples list, one at the beginning, one at the end. People confuse them. They're not the same. The one at the beginning evidently was martyred early, and in the end was martyred late. And we'll make a distinguishing of those two when I get down to the end of this, if I do tonight. Yeah, modern scholars, they're making novel discoveries, yet many of them are convincing, scriptural, and logical arguments about the identities of the disciples and brethren of Yahshua. And I'm glad to say that in our generation, there are some scholars that are taking these other works that describe the lives and acts of these apostles more seriously. I just finished up the Passover plot for about the fourth time I've read it, by Hugh Schoenfield. And Schoenfield, he passed away at about 85, but he actually brought the Nazarenes out of the closet and spent his whole life studying these. Though he wasn't a believer like we are believers, he thought nothing of the idea of the atoning blood of Yahshua. But those fellows have to be like that to get a listen from anybody. If they're strong believers and they confess the tenets of the church, nobody in their area is going to even listen to them. So I would suggest this old book, Passover Plot, was very popular in the early 60s. There's 1 million of them on Amazon for $1 or $2 now. If you can read a book without having to worry about losing your faith every other page, you will learn a lot about the Nazarene Jews, your forebears. And today, there are other ones that I believe have dug deeply into the Nazarene faith of yesteryear. James Robinson just died a year or two ago. Richard Painter, Robert Eisenman, to some extent, James Tabor, and a few more. Now let's go on to Andrew. Unlike the others, Andrew, or Andreas, is a Greek name. Why you have a Greek among these Hebrews? Or a person like Peter? Actually, Petros is also a Greek name. Were Andrew and Peter as brothers? Were they Hellenists? There are other ones in this set of people too, in this cohort. I don't know. Could well be, but you remember in the scripture, if it's a true story, that Philip, who has a Greek name himself, Philippos, horse lover. Philippos met some Greeks that wanted to speak to Yahshua, and Yahshua ignored them, paid no attention to them at all. There's probably a reason in his head, probably a reason that you could pretty easily figure out. But Andreas, or Andrew, simply means a man. Man. andros is man in Greek, or a mighty man. Sometimes in that literature, they call a husband an andros. Man, that's kind of a funny name for a person. Hey, man. Yeah. The Hebrew form might be Adam or Enosh, both of which mean man, or Givar, Gibur means man. Matthew says, a man is Kiphah's brother. Seems unusual that Shimon Kiphah's brother would have a foreign or Greek name. I doubt that Andrew was his name at all. I think that was probably used as a nickname, because with a little letter play, we can get Ananiyahu, Oniya, Daniya, or a number of other very close Hebrew names that Andrew might well have had. Or it could well be, if you've ever looked into the Acts of Andrew, that the early editors wanted to hide his real name. They were all wanted criminals. That was probably the case. This is something that Luke does a lot, especially in the Acts, but also in the Gospels. He hides names, he misnames, he uses nicknames, pseudonyms. He does. How do I know that? Because so many of them can be figured out if we work on them. And that's why I call this the name game. It really is a fun game. If you want to try one, here's one I haven't figured out yet. Go to Acts chapter 13. There's one that I haven't figured out yet. You'll see the names there at the beginning of the chapter. Or one that I have, it's very difficult, but I think I got it, is at the end of Acts chapter 1. There's another one for you to try. If you decide to do it, let me know how you come out. The Acts of Andrew have resurfaced. We can read about Andrew leaving town to become a missionary to the Greeks. Undoubtedly, he knew Greek. That's why we don't have much about him in the New Testament. But there's gobs of stuff outside the New Testament. He probably spoke Greek, and very well. And not only that, but he was performing incredible miracles and influencing high-ranking officials. Andrew might be a nickname, or people that knew Greek might have simply called him the man. Next to Philip, in my last few minutes here, also a Greek name, Philippos, horse lover. You see that name in Acts chapter, is it 5 or 6, where they call out 7 deacons? Every one of those deacons' names in there, everyone is Greek. Not only that, but every one of them is an office in the church. The horse lover was the one who took care of transportation, horses, mules, donkeys. Somebody had to take care of them. Undoubtedly, besides a hitch, they had a barn there someplace. That's just one of them. I would think of him almost as a sergeant at arms. But you notice what he is in the New Testament, if you read closely about him. He's an administrator, and a very good administrator. We find him again in the Acts, appointed as a deacon and seeing to the provisions and welfare of the community of faith. Acts 6:5. So I think it is Acts 6. Some see this as another Philip. But why? Like one Philip has to be a disciple, and the other Philip over here has to be deacon. Why? we remember that Philip stepped out to become a mighty preacher, bringing light to the Ethiopian eunuch and to the Samaritans, who probably hated him. Maybe Philippos rode a horse through Palestine, as his name implies. Maybe he was the only one in Capernaum that had a horse. This would make him the first circuit rider. Maybe the first cowboy. That's Philippos. I also have a brother with that name. Bartholomew, next on the list. And that is Bar-Talmi in Aramaic, Bar-Talmi, which means, well, son of Talmi. But Talmi is a Hebrew word that means a heap of water. So like, Talmi may not have been a son. They use that epithet to describe the person, son of, or of. Most of the time in the New Testament, at least in my recollection, was that the word son is never in there. But Talme meant and means a heap of water. We'd say probably he was a tall drink of water. Talmi, as I said, was a Bible name as well. Talmi was a descendant of the Nephilim or the Gibborim in Canaan, according to Numbers 13:22, a son of Anak, a giant. So if Bartholomew is an added surname, we might imagine him to be a giant or the son of a giant, besides a big heap of water. This makes it pretty clear, at least as a supposition, that this is a big man. And if you read about him again in the Acts of Philip, well, you'll see what he does or what happens to him. History tells us that Bartholomew was also called Nathanael. I don't think so. I think Nathanael was somebody else. I think church people put those together simply because they have to. Well, there's nobody in that other list named Bartholomew, so these two have to be the same. When you're using the Bible, you don't think that way. You don't think that way. You're to study that Bible. Isn't that right, Trelly? Don't read the Bible. Study the Bible. We hear that every week. So this is the guy, Nathanael, if we can jump over to him, who Yeshua met under the fig tree. Nathanael, of course, is a real name. We got a guy that's the president of Israel right now with that name. Netanyahu instead of Nathaniel. And of course, Netanyahu, that's not his real name. That's his surname. He's got a Polish name. I can't think of what it is now, but that face of his, me having grown up with a Polish, kind of like Biden has grown up with Puerto Ricans, I can say that Netanyahu has a Polish face. But the name really means gift of the Almighty, El. Yeshua saw Nathanael under the fig tree, which is a symbol for the kingdom of Israel. This may be a reference to the words of Yahweh through the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel 7 and 10. Everything in the New Testament is a reference back to the prophets. I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them. Oh, I have no doubt that either as a nickname or as his given name, this was in the thought, because at that time, they didn't give people names like Heather or Leroy. They gave names that meant something. We don't do that today. Not generally. Amber. I'm sorry if your name's Amber or Heather. There's just a couple of examples. Maybe whoever gave you the name Amber or Heather looked something up to see what it meant. Because not only does a name give us a recollection of what somebody is or does, but what somebody is or does often follows what that name is. You know that to be true. It was under the fig tree that Yahshua told Nathanael, "You are an Israelite indeed without a gimmick, dolos, without a gimmick." If Nathanael and Bartholomew are the same person, then he may have been a giant of a man, a gift of Elohim to the disciples or to the people around him. Somebody like, well, here's somebody you won't even know of, Buddy Bear. If you watch Quo Vadis, Buddy Bear was the big, strong Christian that always took care of business. But if you're not into 70-year-old movies, then how about Michael Clark Duncan in The Green Mile? Big guy, a good guy, always willing to do somebody a good turn, an overarching friend of the innocent, a strong bear-like person. What you see is what you get, a prophetic and often humorless voice. Wow. The Aramaic books of volume 8 of the so-called church fathers include stories about Bartholomew's mission travels in the East through Asia and his martyrdom of being crucified by the townspeople upon the side of a barn. This too is the Acts of Philip, where Philip, Mary, Bartholomew, John go up against the snake temple. At the time, the city was called Ophisopolis, city of vipers. And in the temple, in the city, vipers were worshipped. And in the temple, there was a pit full of snakes. And one thing you would get is to be thrown in there with the poisonous snakes of all kinds. The other thing you would get, if they were going to kill you, was to be nailed up to the door of the temple, so you could be rightly seen by everyone who came into worship, because they were required to by the king. And these people, the Mary I'm talking about is Mary Magdalene, don't think that she didn't travel teaching. She certainly must have. These people had to find a way, because James had sent them over there to evangelize a very evil city. Hierapolis is the name of it now. Ophisopolis is serpent or viper town. So you can find that in the Church Fathers, number 8. On the other hand, some of the apocryphal books from the West, Rome, tell us of the gross visions of Bartholomew and his battles with the devil, who crawled out of the pit of hell as a gigantic slug, 300 feet long. Took him a long time to get out of the pit of hell with all the smoke and fire. Yahshua tells Bartholomew, Bartholomew, go put your foot on his head. Go put your foot on his head when the thing is 10 times bigger than Bartholomew. Might be big, but he wasn't that big, 300 feet long slug. Let's do Matthew. We got time for him. And then I think we have time for him. Yeah, we do. Matthew is Matit Yahu in Hebrew, Matya in Aramaic, shorter name. I'm sure on the baseball field they called him Mott. Both words mean reward of Yahweh. He's also called Levi in Mark 2:14, which could have been his name instead, but probably if he was at the tax desk, he was probably a Levite because he could read and write and count money. He got a good job with the tax collectors. Levi's also the name of a tribe of Israel and a status within the priesthood. The tribe of Lewites collected the tithes as well as the taxes. Matit Yahu is called, oh, that's a Greek, telothe, tax farmer. I'm sorry, telones sounds like a Mexican dish, doesn't it? Tonight we're having telones. Tax farmer, what it actually means, not a tax collector so much, which means that a tax farmer went out to the farms, little farms, and threatened the people to get their taxes and got from them as much as they possibly could as far as their threats will go, like Zacchaeus or Zacchae, who in the Nazarene Acts becomes a bishop in the Nazarene movement. His names, and this is probably right, they called him the Levi, and they called him Matt. They're found frequently in the Old Testament referring to worship. The Matthews, if you look back, are singers. They're worship leaders, sons of Asaph. Can you understand how Matthew's names work to reveal his person, or at least what he does? Probably a little bit of his character, too. The scripture tells us that Yahshua was highly criticized for going to the table of one who was a tax collector and with sinners and prostitutes. He hung out with prostitutes. He hung out with prostitutes. This has a lot to do also with table fellowship. I should have mentioned that in the table fellowship thing I did about a month ago. Matthew's name means reward. Levites, as servants of the temple, were educated. Most scribes in scripture were Lewites or Leviites, engaged in professional writing, dictation, copying, and recording history. Papias, who you probably heard of, an early believer, born about 70 AD, writes that Matit, quote, put together the oracles of the master in the Hebrew language. The earliest Hebrew gospel of Matit no longer exists, but maybe as a common foundation for our gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One scholar believes that historian Flavius Josephus was Matthew's son, and that could well have been. The timing works out fine. We know that Josephus' father was a priestly sort, a Levite, a priest named Matit. That takes a little more study. If you can break that name game, you'll be doing us all some good. And my time's up. I've gone on for 70 minutes. And so I'll bring this back next week because we've got a few more to go. And probably the most interesting is at the end. Let me just mark a place here in my notes. Now, let me ask you, any questions or comments? I haven't been looking at the chat at all. Anything there? No, nothing there. I don't give you any time to say anything. Uh, Vicky, you've got a great Greek name. Victoria. Victoria. It's the outcome of Nico or Nike. Okay, good. Yeah, very good. Thank you for coming tonight. I like to see a few people here. I appreciate it. I'll have this up maybe by tomorrow. If you think there's somebody that would be interested in this or these kind of series that I'm doing now, then let them know. Get them on or send them over. Give them the link to the performance and pray for me.